Hello, everyone. My name is Lisa. My pronouns are she, her, and I am one of the co-directors of the Notebooks Collective. Founded in 2021, we are a virtual literary art space focused on community, connection, and continued learning. Please check our website at thenotebookscollective.com to see upcoming events and classes. The Notebooks Collective believes that Black Lives Matter and acknowledges that as a virtual organization, our offices are on the lands of the Kickapoo, Nipmunk, Agawam, Massachusetts, and Pawtucket tribes. Native peoples across the world continue to persevere and to celebrate their cultures, and we encourage you to support Native writers and artists. As we do this land acknowledgement, we want to recognize those who are suffering from conquest and terror in Gaza, Ukraine, Congo, and Sudan. Our thoughts are with them. We know that these are stressful times, and we are glad you have joined us tonight to celebrate community. I now welcome Rebecca to introduce our presenters.
Let's see. Okay, good. I thought I was on mute for a second there. Hello, everyone. My name is Rebecca, pronouns she, her, and I am one of the co-directors of the Notebooks Collective. And we are so grateful to have you here tonight for this discussion. Lisa and I have now done these events for more than 3 years. And over that time, we have seen many different in conversation combinations. And one of my favorite combinations and what we have for you tonight is the mentor-mentee conversation. And asking Karen who she would want to be in conversation with, she immediately said Danika. Danika was Karen's student long ago in Minneapolis in the first class she ever taught when she was a teaching assistant in graduate school. Karen says, quote, her work was outstanding from the start, and she's been working hard all these years and has many insightful perspectives on poetry. Moreover, it's a privilege to have seen part of that early beginning and to see that she now has a new book out and has kept on writing. I'm excited for more people to learn about her poems. They take risks and make different turns than mine do, and yet we both have a few somewhat similar inclinations. It will be fun to see what's been changing across time. End quote. We're all mentees and mentors in a sense, and this is how a community grows. But we love how they had a touch point in the beginning of their careers and how have circled back to be together for this event tonight. Danika added, quote, my interest in reading with Karen shares many similarities. While that class was Karen's first teaching experience as a graduate student, it was my first experience in a creative writing class as an undergraduate. Karen is a wonderful teacher and was very encouraging. Having her as an instructor was an influence on my continuing to write and in my own pursuit of my MFA when I finished my undergraduate degree. Karen continues to be a generous mentor and inspiration. And so we're so excited to have them here tonight. And before we begin, I will just read their official bios. Born in the Republic of Panama, Karen Rigby is the author of Fabulosa, Jackleg Press 2024, and Chinoiserie, Ashata Press 2012, which won a 2011 Sawtooth Poetry Prize. Her honors include a National Endowment for the Arts Literature Fellowship, a Vermont Studio Center Fellowship, and a 2023 Artist Opportunity Grant from the Arizona Commission on the Arts. Her poems have been published in the London Magazine, Poetry Northwest, Australian Book Review, and other journals. She lives in Arizona. Danika Stegeman's second book, Ablation, was released by 1111 Press, November 1st, 2023. Her book, Pilot, 2020, was published by Spork Press. She's a 2023 recipient of a grant from the Barbara Deming Memorial Fund and recently spent a 2-week residency in Marathon, Texas, outside Big Bend National Park. Her video poem, The Beetlejuice Reappears, was an official selection for the 2021 Midwest Video Poetry Festival. Stegeman received her MFA in creative writing from George Mason University, where she was awarded the Heritage Fellowship. She currently lives in St. Paul, Minnesota. So now I welcome Karen and Danika.
Thank you, everyone, for being here. And thank you, Danika and Becca and Lisa. I'll turn it over to Danika at the beginning.
Thank you, Karen. Let me say thanks to everyone for being here as well. Thanks to Rebecca and Lisa for hosting us and for the lovely introductions. And thank you to Karen just for her work and presence, and also for asking me to read with you. Okay, so I'm going to read some poems from Ablation for 15-ish minutes. And then Karen's going to ask me some questions, and then Karen's going to read, and then I'm going to ask Karen the same questions. And then at the end, there will be time for you to ask questions. So we'll leave space for that as well. Okay. I should say before I start reading, this book was written after my mom passed away unexpectedly in July of 2020. And so it's in there. Okay. I mouth the word motherless. I mouth the word motherless, and it's a cut that misses, a cut made clean, the clasp of a snapdragon's jaw. I mouth the words cornhopper, hair combs, hand-painted flowers, grayscale photos with X-Acto knife edges. I keep these things in a box. Anxiety pins me in place. I've got 60 needles aimed at my center, 1 point for each year of her life. I stare at cracks in the asphalt and can't seem to leave the parking lot. The funeral home's across a street torn to gravel. They'll repave next week. I move forward to hug my friend, but he and his wife move away slightly. My mom has died during a pandemic. The air's not safe. Don't touch your face. For God's sake, don't touch each other or speak closely. I feel like 1,000 dead birds, one brother says. It'll take months to transfuse our veins with sand and several more before we can bear the heat of our blood again. I tried to watch the sunset, but I couldn't, the other brother says. The clouds got in the way. It's overcast, but refuses to rain until we've left for the quiet of our homes. Weeks later, the sky's heart still bends light, but it matters less. Handful of red, handful of copper. My sister speaks in tongues, but what she's asking for is money. Her loss sharpens. She tucks cash in her pockets and places the sympathy cards in front of me. I face the stack and cut the leaves out, then add them to my grief box. I mishear her words as dust in my heart, wind in my hair. I don't need anything. The sun bleeds through the clouds. I look up and cut paper leaves pour from my eyes. Next, I'm going to read just some excerpts from the title sequence of the book. It's quite long, so I'm only going to read parts of it. But it's a long sequence of mirror cinquains, or sometimes the form is called butterfly cinquains. So it has a specific syllabic structure. From Ablation. See through the window panes of my eyes. Same, not same. Chromosomes mutate a me into a you. Love like a radar map. Love like infrared. Love like heat or light pouring in waves. All my life might fit in my mom's right atrium, in her tachycardic, too fast heart. I fear I carry incoherence in my genes. Glaciers recede, holes open where walls should be. When I say you, I mean daughter. I mean reader. I mean for you to rest in the hollow my heart shapes and unshapes. The morning fogs half in, half out. The leaves drift in part circles, undone. A note resounds. Bird song you sing back to the bird. Transmogrified, I molt into some new figure. this mother, this loosening knot. The bird's wings spread, meadow blown beneath a day moon. My mom's memories mismatch mine. I elide rooms I ran from. She forgets hunger and rage. I lose days, watch shattered glass reform as twilight. Autumn didn't seep through ductless heat vents. There are many ways to express pain. Destruction is just one of them. Hold your breath, then blow it out. I never hid myself in the tall grass. I'm never scared. I've never been empty. I have fallen through ice. I'm not the same, or where I find myself isn't the same. My dreams change. In car crashes, I wrap my body like a halo around yours to absorb the harm. As you form a sense of self, you recognize you're separate from everything. You mirror me, and I mirror you. Our lungs feel the trees. We share symmetry. It reminds us we're real. Trauma passes across generations. This is what's meant by circulatory system. Before birth, my body felt my mom's pain. I recall her life, store her hurt in dark corners. I'm just a pattern of cells trying to heal through repetition. It's easy to become nothing. It's easy to speak softly and shadow by, guttering like a waking nightmare. Keening of flowers, the chop and hum of blades in the heart of a machine. What I suffer trembles when faced with what my mom endured. Battered body, mute voice, rape, a bitter wellspring. I eat paper and vow never to take the same route. A river will sharpen to cut through its own curve and form a new path. Agnes Martin said, we give up things that cover our mind. Some days I'm made of bone. Other days I'm made of water. Some days I've got no skin and tears pour from my eyes and spill over my hands as I rinse jars for jam. Some days I've got no words. I sew love into your jacket where the fabric hems into itself in seams. The grass shifts slip for slip, a hologram redoubling its image so that each piece remembers the whole. I've sent my love into the future. The vessel's a construction of chambers and muscle, spring-fed as a glacial lake. Teardrops shine from our fingers. I hope there's water where you live. So that is ablation or part of it. Next, I'm going to read, there are 4 poems that are kind of interspersed through the second half of the book that are all titled Field. And I'm going to read the second Field poem. It's written after an image, which I will show you later as part of a response to one of Karen's questions. Field. My mother is a nebula. My mother's eyes are closed like she's already a ghost. An exoskeleton twins her. She collapses time. I never called her my mother. My mother isn't inside the car, but neither is she outside the car. Dust disperses. Her hand clutches the door. Her hand clutches the door with devotion and necessity. Her love has painted the body in two-toned blue. You can't see it, but the car's back seat is raw, unupholstered metal. Memory is a host. My dead live here. in a corridor of rust thatched together in a ramshackle structure. The grass is overgrown. When my mother is pregnant, her voice refracts against porcelain as she spills outward. Her scales feather the drain. Seeds spread. The home we left is a field. I watch the field dismantle the shack, swallow rust. My mother clutches the car's door as though it's what keeps her upright, what keeps her from collapsing, what keeps her from vanishing. Remember the quiet evenings. My mother is liminal. My mother is cleft between worlds. She speaks to me. She speaks to me from a mouth filled with clover. I'm going to read just one more, which is from near the end of the book. It's a cento, which means that it's completely constructed of other people's lines. And before I read this poem, I usually like to read the names of the writers and artists who wrote the lines that are in the poem, and they go in the order in which the lines appear in the poem. Robert Creeley, Sylvia Plath, William Shakespeare, George Oppen, James Baldwin, Eric Nelson, who was the defense attorney in the trial of Derek Chauvin, Radiohead, Kid Dakota, C.D. Wright, Hanif Abdurraqib, Harriet Mullen, Reginald Dwayne Betts, At the Drive-In, Elliott Smith, Bessel van der Kolk, Sparklehorse, Blonde Redhead, George Harrison, Otto Lux, Shannon Lay, Lee Bai, Christopher DeWeese, Zachary Schomburg, Langus Largus, E.E. Cummings, Sun Young Shin, The Knife, Tom Waits, The Bible, Emily Dickinson, Elizabeth Bishop, and Mazzy Star. So thanks to those writers and artists, except for Eric Nelson. Thanks to that guy. Okay, heart rate cento. In the construction of the chest, there is a heart, and I am aware of my heart. It opens and closes its bowl of red blooms out of sheer love of me. I cannot heave my heart into my mouth. Of the heart, they say too much, the heart, the heart. I am terrified at the moral apathy, the death of the heart, which is happening here in my country. To further compromise an already compromised heart, a heart that's full up like a landfill, deep in the heart of the land. Look into the dark heart and you will see what the dark eats other than your heart. The actual heart is an ugly machine. It doesn't stir the heart like a true wild rose. Admit that the heart, though not useless, lacks the thing needed for some miracles. I had a friend whose heart was too heavy to hold. Yes, there's blood on the median like a boat without oars. Nobody broke your heart. You broke your own. Heart rate variability is shaped by trauma. Oh yeah, I got a heart of darkness. Won't you feel for me in your heart? There in your heart, something that's never changing. It's time to decide while my heart mourns. I sit heart-stricken at the bloom, in between a heart and home. Today, I will say my fears into a molting bag and let them mean away in there, as doom means doom and love means love, when I'm waiting here, calibrating my heart. I found your beating heart half buried in the woods, yard sale heart, just like mine. I carry your heart with me. I carry it in my heart, crowned in our sins, velvet hearts. And you kept us awake with wolves' teeth, sharing different heartbeats. Lay your head where my heart used to be, and I will remove the heart of stone from your flesh and give you a heart of flesh. Heart we will forget. Some relaxed uncondescending stranger, the heart's release. And while the fireflies are failing to illuminate these nightmare trees, leave my heart down by the water. Thank you.
Thank you, Danica. I always find your reading so mesmerizing. It's almost like an incantation or spell. It's wonderful to hear. Now,
Thank you.
Ablation is your second book. So I was wondering if you could talk to us about that experience of writing a second book versus a first book, of what's changed, what feels new or risky. Were there any wonders or agonies or surprises?
Yes, I will be happy to talk about that. Thanks so much, Karen. So my first book, Pilot, which came out from Spork Press in 2020, is actually mostly composed of erasures of episode transcripts of the TV show Lost. And so part of what I was interested in and what I was doing was like, I wasn't that interested in the I as sort of like a force of propulsion. I was more interested in like the agency being in the poetics and the energy and the kinetics of the language. Like I wanted to be what moved um, the water, I guess, of the words. But I didn't want to be the water. Like I was using a sort of communal I and a communal you that like belonged to speakers in the episode transcripts, like rather purposefully, to try and just like I just wanted to be like behind the curtain, sort of. And Ablation is clearly a much different book. It's written from quite a very personal I. And part of the reason for that is just the nature of the experiences that I had. But part of it, I think, was also like a natural evolution of my own writing. Like I had to sort of reckon with the fact that whether I wanted to hide or not, I am an I and I have agency and authority. But I guess to answer the parts of the question, so there was risk and like agony and opening up in that way and sort of letting go of a reticence to be seen. But that there was also so much wonder in it. I was surprised just by the way the writing opened up and flowed for me. Like it was really difficult to write the poems in the book, but I was able to sort of like write a lot longer poems and allow um, a lot more diversity of experience and like language into the poems, and it's actually done a service to my writing now. Like I feel much less bound up when I'm writing now. It was sort of like um, my own reticence, but also like the pain of the experiences in Ablation were like something that was clogging my creative system, and I needed to sort of like flush it out. And so um the real discovery, I guess, like it was a kind of agony, but it was also so freeing. And I'm not sure if everyone has that experience with their second book, but it was sort of like I felt sort of constricted, and then I found a way to like let myself loose with the second book. Um, so I hope that answers the question a little bit. Thanks.
So it's interesting that you mentioned your first book was inspired by a television show, which we can think of as a form of art. But even Ablation includes photographs and sometimes a stitch paper ephemera. And I know one of the pieces that you read today mentions Agnes Martin. So could you talk to us a little bit about your interest in ekphrasis and using art to sometimes a mask or masquerade that it can obscure, it can also reveal? What's your relationship to using that kind of material?
Yeah, thanks. I kind of always love I'm so inspired by artists of all kinds, not just other writers, but visual artists, filmmakers, music as well. And I feel like I'm kind of always working through mediums or masks in that way. I wanted to talk just to give a specific example because I read that second field poem out of the book, which is written after a specific image. Here, I'll pull it up if I can find it again. But I found this photograph of my mom and her things after she passed away. But so this is the image that it's written after that particular poem. But it was also written after, which does not appear in the book. But my mom, before she died, maybe like a year, had sent me just on Facebook like this link of like a listicle kind of thing that was it was something like 35 man-made structures where nature is just like completely overtaking the structure. So like tree roots growing through brick was one of them. And I actually used that when I initially drafted the poem. I looked at each of those images for about a minute and tried to write in response to the images. And when my mom sent that to me, it sort of surprised me. I was like, Mom, this is exactly what I like to write about. And she was like, I know. And I was like, oh, I didn't even know she was paying that much attention. And so even though you don't know unless I tell you, right, that those images affected the writing of the poem or that they're in the poem, even though I sort of like take them and put them into this space that the photograph that's in the book is giving you, like there's still the spirit of that exchange with my mom, and the spirit of those images she sent me is still in there. This sort of like tender moment when she said I know is like in there. And that's why like a mask or a medium interests me. It allows like a kind of revelation that's felt instead of seen, that's like indirect instead of like direct, which is maybe not how we experience images or objects anyway. We experience them through feeling and through our own, like our being sort of meets the being of the piece of art. Um, and I don't know, that's what's the most real about an experience with art to me. Because we can't see or grasp anything for certain. There's sort of like a gap or a rift between something and what we think of it, I guess. And so I guess I'm just more interested in honoring and observing that rift than trying to obliterate it by like holding on, like grasping onto something or like putting it in exact language. Um, so I don't know. I'm always trying to like. I just feel like ekphrasis acknowledges that sort of rift because it's like writing, but it's not the thing, right? And so um, ekphrasis seems to like acknowledges and honors that space between, and it's I'm always trying to write into that form somehow. Like it shapes my work and is kind of like why do we it's part of the reason we make art, I think, is like to it's a way of sharing and then like extending an idea, right? Someone is a point of light for me, and then I'm maybe a point of light for someone else, and it's all sort of woven together.
Love that last idea about being light for other people. That brings me to my next question. Ablation is writing towards the memory of your mother, but you're also a mother yourself now with the second book. So how has motherhood changed the way you write?
Well, a couple of ways. One of the main things that I noticed when my after I had a child, not like right away, because there's some like adjustment time, certainly, especially with an infant. But I was worried about not finding time to write. And I actually find that I manage my time a lot better, and am more dedicated to finding time to write now that I'm a mom because I have so little free time. My daughter is 6 now, so she requires less than she did when she was 3. But it's still like children take up a lot of time and energy, and of course, I'm so delighted to give that to her. But I also have been really intentional when I do have free like time that's for me, to making sure that I do what I love in that time, and get some writing done. And so like I found myself like a lot more generative than I was before, because I had all this time and I was like, oh, I could, like watch Gilmore Girls for hours or whatever. Like, and there's not time for that. So when I have free time, I write poems. And I think that's good for me. And it's also, I do that for my daughter too. And I think about that, and I think about it very intentionally, because I, I don't remember my parents sort of like gave up their dreams, and just ended up working and being parents. And I love them for that. But I want my daughter to see me like doing what I love, and see that as a model, I guess. So I think about that too. Like if I want her to grow up and like do the things that she loves and like feel like a whole person, then I should be doing that too. Um, she also reminds me just to like delight in and consider the weirdness of language on a daily basis. She says strange things or like questions what words mean, which I think a lot of kids do. But just like for as one example, I think she was about like 3 or 4, and I was making French toast and she was helping me, and she was like, "Oh, we need to flip them," and I was like, "No, no, they're not ready to flip yet." And she was like, "How do you know?" And I said, "I feel it in my bones." And she said to me, "I want to see your bones," like very genuinely. Um, and I ended up putting that in a poem because it was just like I had used this sort of like tired metaphor, right, that we've heard a million times. And then she was just like, "No, like I want to see those bones." Like she wanted to see beneath my skin, like, and see where that knowing was coming from, right? Um, and so just like things like that. I really like think more about sentences. Like even yesterday, she was picking rocks and like picking rocks that she felt were magical out of, just like the normal landscaping rocks in the front of a building. And she was like, "Oh, I see too much." Like, but she meant too many. Like she couldn't pick up all the rocks. But even just like the phrase, like, "I see too much," um, means so much if you like look at it and think about it at the level of language. Um, so yeah, that's how a myriad other ways, but those are two of the big ones. Thanks for that question.
Thank you, Danica. So to carry on with this theme of eclipses, I will mostly be reading poems inspired by art. And this first one is by Hieronymus Bosch. Let me see if I can get you the URL into the chat. I know how to use this. Let's see. That way you can see what I'm reading about. So here we go. To Hieronymus Bosch. Before a yolk yellow break in the clouds, Christ looks down on pitchforks, gathered in scenes folkloric, the hay wain, a lurid moral painted on shutters. But what I'm asking has nothing to do with haystacks, though the impossible pompadour anchors the central panel, saftig, even holy, color of chamois, as much as it does with the figure in a wide-brimmed hat, pressing a dagger to a man's throat. No one pays him any mind. Look right, and a blindfolded head dangles from a pole. Medieval terror, like 21st century terror. In your version of hell, the occupants are always grotesque, which is far from what I imagine. I always believed the forked tongue sprung from beauty. The devil made lethal, not for his hideous soul, but his ability to hide it. I have to hand it to you for your brutal genius, palette of robin's egg blue, studded with cardinal red. Among anonymous villagers, there's a path to carve with oversized wheels from setting forth on it. Now, this next one is chrysanthemums. Against Chagall's blue dark, chrysanthemums, extravagant as Chinese New Year's lions, heads flecked with rust petals pushing the frame. I love their shaggy forcefulness, a bronze green leaves a hammered sculpture. Against illumined order, movement, and repose, an angel in flight is neither warrior nor vision, so curved by the artist's brush that he's harmless. One November on O'Hara Street, I read in a yellow brick hospital, absorbing nothing. About the mind's corridors, its inward silence, I lived without flowers or consequence. The cut of a street-side bloom obliterates nothing. I meant alleviates in that burrow of snowfall, red moons under my nails. I have spent some time living in Pittsburgh, and I used to live on Fifth Avenue, which is a historic street full of many mansions. So here, walking down Millionaire's Row. Forget about resplendence. River of black beads, down a backwards bead dress. Better to write the blistered heel where leather bit, smear of lipstick where I last kissed. I walk down Pittsburgh's East End, thinking of you. Fifth Avenue, once Millionaire's Row, in the robber baron era. I loved you a mansion away from the road of Shalom Gardens, down to Oakland and back. Winter sun outside the Carnegie Library, an idea I had about grand arrivals. All my sins are carnal peonies. I watch the lights flick on inside a Gilded Age Tudor, dotted with snow. And that, too, was another loneliness. The last time I walked beside you, a cloud overhang, the color of onion skin blurred the horizon. I wanted to write, but none of the words meant saudade. In Hendrik Averkamp's Landscape with Skaters, I always loved the panorama of villagers in their miniature industry, their faces unbothered, closer to joy, the painter's name graffitied on the woodshed door. Now, I'm not always turning to paintings. Sometimes I do turn to other mediums. So this next one is inspired by Carolina Costner, who is an Italian figure skater. She was skating during the Sochi Olympics. To Carolina Costner on Bolero. Because I live for the comeback, staged in black. Cold expanse waiting to be ripped. Because I love the way one arm lifts in time to what Ravel imagined as a masterpiece, with no music, repetition made magic only because each shift intensifies. Piston or hammer in the ear. I love the ice that brings us here. Across the years spent counting spins, an illusionist flight of doves, or Samara in the rain. Because I've walked through gray cities, gray futures, I love the sudden break as evidence of nothing, exactly, but the surface of things tattooed with light, for a cloud leads the hill. I still believe in beauty, a measured movement, a name fogged on a bus pane. Whatever we love is already leaving, whatever we touch dissolves. So like Danika, I also have a fondness for television and sometimes go down that rabbit hole. So this next one is based on Endeavour, which is the prequel to the Inspector Morse series about a young constable who eventually becomes an inspector in Oxford, England. So the first couple of lines basically run through several of the episodes. Watching Morse on Endeavour. Nowhere is safe in 1960s Oxford. Not the boathouse or boarding school, wooded path, cheap flat, church floor, doesn't matter. We're all going the way of the dead with lipstick or pulped heads, torso slashed by a wayward tiger. The clue isn't always a cipher. The background, a greenlit riverbank, a state gone to seed in that harvest light. Regret pulls like a frighter, which is why a question with no answer. Who couldn't you save? Echoes into me. When a black jaguar cases the alley, the orchestra slows. I'm waiting, like you, for the closing minutes when an actor casts an empirical gaze and every fact locks into place. That's what I'm missing when I consider my past as a forensic scene. There's no one but me to trace what a chalk mark means. Remember when a stolen Fabergé egg twined with revenge? How it killed the murderer to remember, but it's worse to forget. The girl I can't bring back cut her own hair in the mirror. That specific, calculated blame, so that the only way to live was to live. In TV mysteries, everyone gets what's coming. Here, a crime happens with no atmospherics, languid as love. Now, I'll read a very short poem that I don't typically read. Omens. In the parable of the wolf, the one you feed is the one that grows. So the wicked wolf fattens on deer meat, and the silver one starves for love. Or the first wolf swallows stone, while the other tracks your scent down an iced road. Whichever wolf you choose, the whole of an animal's mouth terrifies. The undercoat tinged in black smells of new blood. Vicious or noble, what you think you see, what you know, the beast sings a river to bones. One last one. Portrait as Fata Morgana. Because horizons bend in strange configurations. Because the Flying Dutchman was me. Because polar airstreams. Because the fortress shrouded in fog draws whalers to the edge. Because the castle inspires fear and miracles. Because priests wrote of crystal cities in 1643. Because the aim of ordinary love is to miss where illusion falters. Because it's better to land on phantom islands than look underneath. Because a cloud is no more headstone than avian kingdom. Because what's left when the vision dissipates is the world gone blue and no one to say I was particle or wave. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. I love those poems. I spent a lot of time with Fabulosa, which is an incredible book. And I love hearing you read it out loud. Is it just like it reminds me of how like perfectly and carefully chosen like every word is, and it like just resonates and echoes. I'm gonna ask Karen the same three questions that Karen asked me. So, and as Lisa has noted, in the chat, you can send your questions either directly to Lisa or Rebecca in the chat, and we will address those after I'm done asking Karen questions. Okay, Karen, here we go. So your first book, Chinoiserie, came out in 2012, is that right?
Yes.
And I would love to hear you talk about the experience of writing a second book versus a first book. What's changed for you? What feels new or riskier? Were there wonders, agonies, surprises, detours, discoveries, or anything in between or beyond those?
Okay, so I'm going to go back in time to answer that one. When I was a teenager, I had a teacher who introduced me to Rilke's Letters to a Young Poet, which I think is a book that a lot of poets do end up reading. And he has this one section that goes, ask yourself in the most silent hour of your night, must I write? Now, at that time, I was very young, and that seemed very appealing. Because he more or less goes on to say that if your answer to that is yes, then build your life around that. And that felt like permission to me to follow this kind of urgent and maybe romantic calling. So to that end, I did my undergrad degree in creative writing, and then I went on to do an MFA. And part of that MFA was to write a thesis, which is actually the very early version of what the book would become, even though the end result is much different since it happened over many years. But I think in that sense, my first book had this kind of intensity surrounding it. Because even though it didn't come out until 2012, a lot of the poems had been written much earlier. So in a sense, I think of it as a book about young adulthood, if you will. I mean, I wrote it clearly at a different place in time. But second book is entirely different. It's been about a dozen years in between both books, and in between that time, I've had 2 kids, a lot of life has happened, and I've actually come around to thinking that I don't really agree with Rilke after all. That idea that, that writing is like this ultimate do or die kind of thing, I don't think it really deserves that kind of pedestal, because you could easily, burn bright and burn right out. And that's not really the way to go. So I'm more inclined to think now that instead of putting the writing at the center and trying to, build your life around that, that it's the other way around, that it's your life that goes at the center and the writing ebbs and flows as you go along there. Now that distinction might seem subtle or academic or abstract, or can really tell the difference between reading both books in terms of what was I feeling or thinking at the time. Maybe not, but it really is a different kind of orientation for me. And in that sense, I think the second book, Fabulosa, is actually a whole lot more fun to write. It's not coming out of grad school. It's not coming out of this pressure of ambition or of, I don't have a first book yet, but I'd like to. I mean, I've crossed that hurdle or barrier or goal or whatever you want to call it, in a sense. So now the second time around, there's more joy to it. And someone recently pointed out to me that the second book has a little bit more humor to it, which had never occurred to me. When I was writing it, I didn't see that, but now I do see it. So the main difference for me is that the second book didn't necessarily come more easily. I mean, it took a really long time to put together, but I feel like it represents a little bit more of who I am. It's more true.
Thank you, Karen. What you were saying about Rilke and like writing Fabulosa more from like your life and like a space of joy in some ways, like reminded me of something David Lynch, the filmmaker David Lynch, said in an interview once when someone asked him about like the sort of trope of the suffering artist, and he was like, why would you write better if you're suffering, or create work better if you're suffering? Like if the body is sick, that's not something to be praised, and it's like not easier to create art. And so then it's just like, why, if you're sort of suffering from the inside, or like kind of having a mania over like writing and not living your life, why would that make the writing better? And I think that like I find too that like when I'm living my life better, the art comes with it too, like the writing comes with it. So I love what you said about that. Okay. So question 2, ekphrastic poems, which we've talked quite a lot about. being sort of framed through the lens of a work of art, or I like you had that poem about the figure skater. Like I think ekphrasis can like extend far beyond just like specifically like a painting. But as I sometimes think about ekphrasis, the poems are then formed through a medium or a mask, which both obscures and reveals, imbues and allows. Could you talk about your interest in ekphrasis and how it shapes or takes shape within or shapes the poems in the book? Fabulosa.
So Stanley Plumley has this poem called Infidelity, which is about witnessing the tension between his parents. It's a terrifying poem. You can find it online. But it also has this really fantastic line that's always struck me that goes, "Language is a darkness pulled out of us." And that's sometimes how it feels to me when I'm writing a poem. It's like I'm having to haul something out of a deep ocean. And sometimes that makes it very hard work, especially emotionally or mentally. And sometimes I'm not willing to go there. If I have a blank page, language is a darkness pulled out of us is not always where I want to go right away. So sometimes when I need a breath of air, then I do turn to art, paintings especially, because I find that when I do that, having the visual gives me the language. I'm not reaching for it. I can start out with a description or an image or begin with the painting. And as I start there, then gradually, then I might start going into deeper layers or pulling in aspects of my own life. And in that way, we talked previously about ekphrasis being like a kind of mask. It kind of gives me a layer where I can reveal things about myself, but through the story that someone else has already made. Except I'm not merely replicating it or simply like literally transcribing what I'm seeing. I'm including part of myself in there as well. And that's always interesting, especially in poets like maybe Diane Seuss. She has her whole collection with the still life and the dead peacocks and a girl. And even when I read, just any poet really that goes into art, what interests me there is not so much whether or not I'm familiar with the art that they're describing, because I may or may not be, and I might go and look it up. What interests me is to see it how they're seeing it. And that happens through the language. So for example, in that Hieronymus Bosch poem, I compared that, that big haywain haystack to chamois, which for me is a really domestic image. It's that like cleaning cloth that you would use for a car wash. I could have said something else. I could have said the color of sand, the color of a lion, flower. But because I chose that very particular word, it kind of reveals a little bit of me as you're reading it. It might be an unusual choice. Like, why would anyone choose that? But it gives you a little bit of a glimpse. So in that way, I can reveal things about myself to the reader, but without a full disclosure. I think sometimes it's important to retain a certain privacy. We don't always need to, write every trauma onto the page for everyone. So in that sense, that's how the art appeals.
Thank you, Karen. I love that example with the chamois. I'm just thinking about all different ways to name a shade brown. Okay. Third question. How you are also a mother of two. How has motherhood changed how you write?
I think it's pretty much changed everything, but I kind of want to broaden this for the sake of the audience. So it's not only motherhood, you could be caregiving for someone else who maybe isn't a child. You might have that kind of responsibility in another capacity, but just in general, when you do have that going on in your life, it requires a lot of flexibility about time. So I find it really intriguing that for you, it's kind of maybe intensified your focus in that sense that now that there's less time, you're going to make, better and good use of it. it's kind of gone in the other direction for me. I've become far more flexible about it. And I've come to think that it's a kind of generosity. Because caregiving or parenting, there's a lot of interruption that goes with it in many forms, like whether you're making dinner that night or you're attending to the homework or whatever else, whatever is going on in that background periphery, I've come to see it that I have to view that not as an obstacle. It's not something that I need to become frustrated about in terms of this is taking away from the writing. I have to view it as a form of generosity that in the larger panorama is going to add on something to it. And the other thing that's changed for me is not only being flexible about time, but believing that you're going to find it, that there is enough time. There isn't this rush or pressure or urgency. Even if the day didn't unfold the way that you planned, that's all right. You know, for me now, writing is a slower progression, but as long as it is progressing, that's still writing to me. Even if I'm reading a book or just reading even one poem, or if I just found an interesting word that day or an image, I'm still background gathering subconsciously. So I'm really a strong believer that even if you're not actively writing, part of you is still writing. So in that sense, you can view all of it as a kind of gift.
I agree with that. It's all writing, all the experiences. Okay, so those are the questions that we have. Are there audience questions? Have we gotten any of those? Otherwise, Karen and I can just keep talking.
This is Becca real quick. I think Lisa and I were talking, and one of the things that I was thinking about and listening to you both talk about writing as moms is how do you overcome blocks or fear in your writing? Like if you have a certain amount of time to write and you feel blocked, or just speaking to that general, like how do you get past blockages?
Thank you. Do you want to go first, Karen, or do you want me to go first?
You can go first. Go ahead.
I some of what Karen says about being flexible about time is really resonating with me. I used to sort of like pressure myself to really like something has to be amazing or it has to like get done right now. And that's like even when I sit down to write now and I know I have like focus and particular time, that's sort of like not how I think about writing. Like I do think about a project as sort of like growing alongside me in time. And so if something is like not working, it's not working for a reason. I'm not ready to write that yet. I do have some sort of like I have felt blocked in the past and found some kind of like workarounds for that, which I can talk about. One of the things I do is that I do try to write one line per day. And by that, I do not even mean sentence. Sometimes it's one word, sometimes it's three words. But I found that treating writing like other things that I give devotion to, like my body when I do yoga or my mind when I'm doing meditation, and I do that every day. It's like exercising a muscle. And so I find myself getting less concerned about even being blocked when I've written a line per day. And then sometimes I have like, a whole Google Doc full of lines that I haven't done anything with by the time I have a Saturday to sit down and write for a couple hours. And so I'll use that pile, right? And so that's a way around the blockage, is like just having something else to riff off of. I use prompts a lot in the same way. And then I just like, even if I never do anything with like a free write off of a prompt, it's still like it's getting the juices like flowing. I'm sorry, I just used that metaphor, but it was what came to my mind. You know, it keeps things moving. Um, and also like honestly, if I can't write, there are a lot of different ways. Like all of it is writing. Like there are sometimes just like if it's not coming, then I read something or I draw something instead. Like I've set aside that time. Or I'll even just like answer an email or respond to a friend's work that they have sent me because it's all the work. And if that's how I can show up that day, that's how I show up. Um, Karen, that's about as much as I have to say about that if you want to answer it too.
Well, I think for me, it's helpful to think of writing across the course of a lifetime. Now, I know that seems like a really long span of time in which to be thinking, but it takes some of the pressure off. That I'm not necessarily trying to write a poem or a book, but a whole body of work. And that does take time. If you happen to be blocked for whatever particular reason, that might not be the case a couple months down the road. You kind of relax about it. It's okay. Like there's this wonderful anecdote that I read once. It might have been in a Poets and Writers interview, maybe. It was with the poet Louise Glick, and she was talking about how for a spell that she couldn't write, and what she was doing was looking at seed catalogs. That was all that she was able to do at that time, and that became the wild iris, which is just incredible to me, and that just kind of reinforces to me that you can be doing something where your mind hasn't fully made the connections yet, and it might feel like you're not writing, that you're gathering something under the surface, and it will eventually come to something. Now, the other way that I tend to get my mind working is to read people who are entirely unlike me, because that gives me an interesting perspective, another vocabulary, another form. Like at the present moment, I'm reading a lot of Linda Hull, which I hadn't done before. And she uses like a lot of jazz and bird metaphors and just makes these really interesting word choices that wouldn't occur to me. Like one poem uses the word acetylene, and that's seems so industrial and fiery and just unique to me. So that also helps too, to just kind of be, well, I don't want to sound like a magpie, but just gathering the little pieces that resonate.
That's great. Thank you, Karen. Um, I'm just gonna add, that reminds me of I have another manuscript that's not out or anything, but that I wrote alongside Pilot. That's an erasure of a book. And it sat forever and I didn't know what to do with it. So I just like left it. And then like I got an idea for what I ended up pasting parts of a mall directory into the erasure. Like it's actually like a physical erasure. But it was just like I had to live for years before that came to me when I was riding the bus, you know? And so I don't know, who knows how these pieces come together? They do. Um, Lisa and Rebecca, are there other questions or should Karen and I ask each other questions?
Why don't you continue asking each other questions and we'll check the chat again and see if anything else has come through.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, I have a question for you, Danika, since we're kind of talking about piecing things together. Like a lot of your poems are lists or collages or kind of long accumulations of related material. And I wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about that kind of process when you're writing a much longer poem. Does it tend to evolve across a really long time? Do you generate a lot of material that you then have to trim back? Or what is it like? I find that really fascinating because I have yet to write a very long.
Yeah, it's different for different poems, really. With Ablation, um, there was a different so there was a different process. Some of the poems just like came out long and that's just how they were. And I needed to get them out, and I wrote them down. Like The Nothing is a poem close to the middle of the book. And it's a difficult poem. And that one tumbled out of me line after line. In the car I was driving, actually, and I was like, I pulled over, and my husband at the time, I was like, you need to drive. I'm going to sit in the back seat and write this poem down because it won't stop coming, and I'm not going to be able to hold it in my brain. Um, but of course, that kind of accumulation was because I had been thinking about and like immersed in the idea of this book, and writing other poems around it, um, and considering it and pulling sort of archival pieces together. So I do think like living alongside it is part of the reason that sort of poured out. I think there was also an urgency of sort of like having held this information in for so long, and then I just needed it to come out. But then other things like the title sequence, Ablation, which I read from earlier, I really did accumulate that across a long span of time. I originally drafted that on index cards, and I would bring them, I carried them in my purse. And when I got to, like, say I was going to trivia at a bar with friends, if I got there first, or sometimes I got there first on purpose, so I could sit there and just like write lines down. Or, like I'd stop while I was walking, and I still do this. I'm writing a book length poem now, and this is what I'm doing a lot. Like, I carry small journals with me, and I'll write and I'll write as I'm walking, and I pull these pieces together across time. And then the tricky thing becomes like sequencing and figuring out what order those pieces want to be in. But I've sort of just I pull them together on bits of paper through time, and then it's hard to describe. Like I have a feeling in my body or something that I know that they're ready to be pulled together, and then I'll put them together. And then I spend a lot of time revising. Um, but I don't know, my process has always been sort of like accumulative in that way. Like when I started writing um as a teenager, like when I started writing poems, I was collaging text basically without realizing it. Like one of my first poems was basically like taking a track listing from Nirvana's Unplugged CD and like some of the lyrics and like moving those things around and rewriting them over and over again. So it's just how my brain works. Thanks, MC. um, uh, I hope that answered your wonderful question, all of my rambling. I guess in return, I would like to hear a little bit more about your drafting process. Like I imagine it's maybe different for different poems and across time. But like how do you um begin to assemble the pieces of a book, and how did you know that all of these poems are going to end up in Fabulosa? Are there pieces that you've written that do not fit in with the book? Can you just talk a little bit about your process of assembling and putting together the book?
Don't necessarily recommend this, but I tend to write line by line. So I don't usually have multiple poems and drafts going at once. I tend to write one poem and just work through it to the next poem and the next. That makes the process a lot slower. But the reason I do that is because I really value that level of precision, that kind of word by word nuance. So in that sense, I didn't have a big stack of poems to be working with. Pretty much whatever I was writing was going to end up in the book because I knew I wasn't going to make a page count of a full length without doing that. There are a couple of exceptions. The few pieces that I did end up leaving out were mostly because they felt like repetitions or lesser versions of the same themes that wouldn't have made it a strong collection. So I guess in that sense, I'm not really sure. So, yeah, I write extremely slowly. Part of the process for me involves sound because I do read my poems out loud at a certain point. And if the line doesn't sound right, then I'm not inclined to trust the poem, because it kind of signals to me that I've taken a detour somewhere that's not the right way to go, that it needs a revision. It's it's when the sound starts pulling together for me that I have a sense that the poem is revealing something to me that's true and that it's close to being finished. So I tend to revise in terms of how it sounds to me.
I'm going to interject because we do have a question from MC. It'll probably need to be our last question because we're getting close to our time at the end. And I think you probably each maybe want to read a poem. I'm not sure. We'll see if we have that time. But the question is, I'm trying to formulate a question based on these two answers, which both feel like they're about how relating to other writers is a part of writing. How do you think about relationship or community in your writing?
Okay, I'll answer that one first. I have a friend who I met at a reading. We were introduced by the host of the reading series, and for nearly the past decade, we've been exchanging poems back and forth. Her name is Sharon, and that's been invaluable to me. I wouldn't have been able to write the second book if I didn't have that. And the way we do it is, with some exceptions for, holiday or whatever break, is to each send each other a poem a week, which is not very much, but that's enough. Over the course of a year, you will have accumulated something. And that matters, because you're not writing alone, you're not writing into the silence. You have this notion that there's someone on the other end waiting to receive it. And that's really helpful to me.
Thanks so much, Karen, and thank you, MC, for that wonderful question. Um, I community is so important. Like, I also feel the same as Karen about like I have a workshop group that formed during the pandemic that I meet with. We meet every once a month and like spend an hour of time talking about a big chunk of work. And the effect that that has had on like me completing big chunks of work like I can't is immeasurable. And also just like there's something about attunement and like um reading like all we're all writing different things or one of the people isn't as even necessarily doesn't identify as a writer, but like we're creating from different spaces and creating different things, but like we understand one another's work and can like approach it from what's like I it's to be understood and approached in that way and given feedback in that way is like very is like so important. I also think about community like I read The Gift by Lewis Hyde in the winter. And I think a lot about like there's this scene in there. It's talking a lot about gift economies and how they're like different than how we used to like culture like as a community and a culture like as people have like not just a monetary economy but like a gift economy where basically like um something is given and it just keeps getting given and it's like a circle that goes around and around, and how art is like that also. And I think a lot about this scene where like Ezra Pound is near the end of his life, and Allen Ginsberg comes like goes to Italy to talk with him, to get his blessing and give him his blessing, because Ezra Pound's work meant so much to Allen Ginsberg. And at that point in time, like Ezra Pound was embarrassed by like his politics and how he had behaved as a younger person, but it's still like it meant so much to Allen Ginsberg. And then like Lewis Hyde talks about how Allen Ginsberg took this sort of spark that Ezra Pound had created and then just like despite the politics and whatever else was going on, he extends Pound's work forward in time. And then whoever Allen Ginsberg touches, like Alice Notley, let's say, that extends forward in time. And so I think about that a lot. And that's such an appropriate question, actually, MC, for reading with Karen, who is a mentor, because I think about who Karen connects me with in time. Or like how having a dinner with C.D. Wright and having her as a visiting instructor when I was at George Mason connects me to Robert Creeley, connects me to George Oppen, and like back in time, and who I will maybe connect forward in time, right? So that's how I think about community.
That's so amazing. Thank you for answering those questions. We're pretty much at the end of our time together. So I want to thank both Karen and Danika for their time and their poems and their thoughtful answers to each other's questions and to ours. Becca and I are so grateful for time like this. If you enjoyed this event, please follow us, the Notebooks Collective, on our social media accounts and sign up for our newsletter if you haven't done so already. We promise we don't spam you. You get information usually once a month and then before events so that you don't forget. The links have been dropped in the chat and they are also available on our website, which is thenotebookscollective.com. That's also where we have more events listed. There's a class next week with Sarah Moore Wagner and other in conversations coming up. So you can find all of those at thenotebookscollective.com/events. One last thing before we go, we would love if everyone would unmute and please give Karen and Danika a round of applause. Woo! And that's all for us from tonight. Thank you so much for coming to this event, and we hope to see you again really, really soon. Have a good night.